to each of them. We are very grateful to each of them for supporting these opportunities to gather and learn together online when we cannot safely do so in person. A reminder that your microphone and camera are not on, so you can relax. However, we do encourage you to submit questions for Mr. Sciutto via the chat box found at the bottom of your screen on most devices. My name is Megan Wilden, and it is an honor and delight to be the Executive Director of OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. We're also very proud of the fact that we are one of only 3 OLLIs to be associated with the community college. For those who are not familiar with us, OLLI at BCC provides educational, social, and volunteer opportunities designed especially by and for people 50 years and better. We have over 1,300 members and produce over 120 different programs each year, from classes in science and literature to distinguished speakers, special events, and more. Our members are just like you, interested in the world and learning more about it from fabulous speakers and instructors in great company. If you're not yet a member, I encourage you to consider joining. Our fall semester of non-credit online classes with no tests and no grades begins September 1st and can be enjoyed from wherever you are. This Conversations with Authors series would not exist without the extraordinary support of Lisa Sharkey, Senior Vice President and Director of Creative Development for HarperCollins Publishers, where she has acquired and overseen the editing of more than 40 New York Times bestsellers. She always has fascinating books in the pipeline, including We're Better Than This, the late Congressman Elijah Cummings' memoir, Battle of Brothers, William and Harry, by royal biographer Robert Lacey, and Biohack Your Brain, How to Boost Cognitive Health, Performance, and Power by neuroscientist Kristen William, to name just a few. Thanks to Lisa and her team at HarperCollins, we have more great authors to look forward to as well, including Larry Burns, the former Vice President of R&D at General Motors, author of Autonomy, The Quest to Build the Driverless Car and How It Will Reshape Our World, Alexis Wachowski, author of the new book, The Information Trade, How Big Tech Conquers Countries, Challenges Our Rights, and Transforms Our World, Jean Guerrero, author of the new book, Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. And we're very much looking forward to having Maya Rockamore Cummings, who will talk to us about her late husband, Congressman Elijah Cummings, and his new memoir, We're Better Than This. All these and more are coming up in the next 2 months, so watch your email for more details soon. And now it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Lisa Sharkey, who will introduce tonight's speakers. Lisa?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Megan, and welcome to another night in which we dig deep to fully understand the depths of trouble we have gotten ourselves into over the last 1,307 days, 7 hours, and 4 minutes. We all know how disruptive life has been since COVID-19 took hold of the world, and in particular our country, and the effects of what we've all been through will certainly be long lasting. But tonight we are here to talk about something that's been arguably even more not only disruptive, but destructive because of the presidency of Donald Trump, which has shaken our standing on the world stage to its very core. We see it each and every day in the Twitter tantrums and the quick sound bites on the news and the tumultuous news cycle, one that seems to be capable of hitting new lows nearly every day. Another one of our authors, who is a colleague of Jim Sciutto's at CNN, Jim Acosta, CNN's chief White House correspondent, was asked on one of these recent OLLI talks, is Donald Trump crazy? And Jim's answer was yes, crazy like a fox. This, my friends, is what the Madman Theory is all about, as you will hear from Jim Sciutto shortly. Jim's record speaks for itself. As CNN's chief national security correspondent and anchor of CNN Newsroom, Jim Sciutto spent 2 decades as a foreign correspondent stationed in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East before returning to Washington, D.C. to cover the Defense Department, the State Department, and the intelligence agencies for CNN. His work has earned him Emmy Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Award, the Merriman Smith Memorial Award for Excellence in Presidential Coverage, and he is a graduate of Yale and a Fulbright Fellow. Jim and I overlapped briefly when I was senior producer at ABC's Good Morning America from 2000 to 2005, and he was a top correspondent at ABC Network before he headed off for his amazing chapter at CNN, and I moved into book publishing. Among the advanced praisers of Sciutto's book, which is all based on primary interviews with people who have or still do work in the Trump administration, we have Bill Kristol, Andrea Mitchell, David Gergen, Michael Isikoff, and Wolf Blitzer, who said, which is, I think is very funny, that he already thought he knew everything there was to know about Trump's thinking on national security and foreign policy, but in reading this truly wonderful book, he realized he didn't really have the same in-depth picture of where President Trump was coming from and his decision-making process until reading this comprehensive and deeply reported pages of the book. In speaking to CNN's Jim Acosta about Jim Sciutto earlier today, Acosta had this to say: Jim Sciutto is more than an anchor and a correspondent. He's an expert on the international diplomacy beat. His coverage of Trump's volatile tenure on the world stage has been invaluable. We are so lucky to have this window into the reasons behind Trump's calamity of a legacy tonight, and we are thrilled that the journalist overseeing the questioning of Jim tonight, prior to my putting some of your amazing questions in front of Jim, is Daniel Lippman, who is a native son of Great Barrington. He not only attended the Waldorf School in Great Barrington, but his very own grandmother started the Waldorf School in Great Barrington. His parents, David Lippman and Honey Sharp, still live in Great Barrington. And from what I hear, and this is very personal, I think they're watching tonight with my own stepfather and his significant other, Art Sherman and Enid Michelman. Lippman attended Hotchkiss and GW, and he got his journalism start as a summer intern at the Berkshire Eagle, and he also worked at the Berkshire Record. He's a reporter covering the White House for Politico. He's just emerged from one of those fabulous White House presidential news conferences, so we'll see if anything's breaking and if we've hit a new low. And he writes playbooks, great weekend reads, and he's really been an amazing correspondent and reporter working for the Wall Street Journal, for Reuters. He's traveled to the Turkish-Syrian border. He's reported for CNN.com and the Huffington Post. So I'm so excited tonight to bring you two incredible men in conversation. So take it away, Jim and Daniel.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. And thank you for joining us, Jim, and congratulations on the book, which I really enjoyed reading over the weekend. So it was a thrill to read. I guess my first question would be, there's been a ton of Trump books that have been written over the last 4 years. So why did you want to write your book, and what do you think makes it different from all the dozens of other books that are out there?
Let me get to that first. Let me just thank everybody for taking time out of your schedule to spend with Daniel and I. It's always an honor when people do that. Thanks, Daniel, for rushing out of the press conference to join me tonight. Lisa, thanks for calling me Jim Sciutto, because growing up in New York, that's what everybody called me when I was a kid. So let's stick with that. And the best thing Megan said was to call 50 and better, which, having just turned 50, I'm gonna run with that for the next, well, however many years. But thanks to all of you. So to your question, Daniel, why this book? I wrote this book, or set out to write this book, because it struck me that as we came to the end of 4 years of Trump, that there'd been a lot of talk of his effect on various places around the world. But to my knowledge, no one had brought together in one look at what is his America First? What do his own advisors say that is? And this book is all, as you know, Daniel, it's all interviews with people who worked in the Trump administration at senior level. So how did they describe it? And then how do they describe how it played out, the president's decision-making, et cetera? And then what I try to do is bring it together and say, okay, where did it work? Where didn't it work? Where are we 4 years later on North Korea, on Iran? I mean, you had all these disruptive approaches to each of these places. Trump claims to have earned the world's respect again. You've heard that once or twice or many more times. Is that actually true? And are we actually safer? So that's why I set out to do this. And that's what I hope makes this one a little bit different, because in addition to being an inside tale of his administration, it's also meant to be kind of a scorecard, an analysis, you know, where it has left us after these 4 years.
So I guess a big theme of your book is the president's unpredictability, which can be seen in almost every decision and issue that he gets involved in. What did most of your sources who worked for him, what did they think of his strategy and how successful or unsuccessful that it has been?
The shortest version answer to that question is there's not much strategy, right? This idea of three-dimensional chess is just not true. This is a seat-of-the-pants decision maker. Now, not having a strategy doesn't mean you don't have goals, right? The president does have goals in places, standing up to China, changing that relationship, ending the endless wars, as you'll often hear him say. But the criticism from inside is that he, it's a scattershot decision-making policy, decision-making process, and often the decisions come on the fly, often contradicting the president's own previous plan. I mean, there are these massive pendulum swings back and forth in the moment. I mean, Syria is an example. I tell the story in the Syria chapter is, the president tweeted America's withdrawal from Syria twice over the span of 10 months. No discussion with his advisors in advance, no national security making process, no connection to a larger strategy. Forget about the Mideast or the world, even for Syria. What was the goal of pulling out? The goal of going in was to destroy ISIS. Why did he get on the phone with the Turkish president in December 2018 and just say, we're done, I tell the story in there about how his advisors kind of drew him back. And this is another consistent feature of the Trump administration is people around him trying to, limit his worst impulses. And they did in Syria for 10 months. And then Trump did it again. Another phone call with Erdogan, another tweet. And then again, you see his advisors try to hem that in as best they can. Now that ability and that effort has waned over the course of his 4 years because, as you've covered, Daniel, and I know a lot of folks listening tonight have watched and read about, the president has one by one jettisoned folks who are willing to disagree with him or challenge those decisions. So that's become harder over time. And one thing I'll say, folks I talked to in this book, which is consistent with what you heard someone like John Bolton say, in a second term, the half measures, if you want to call them that, of the first term would very likely become full measures. Denigrate NATO in the first term, possibly pull out in the second term, things like that.
Do your sources feel proud to have served in the administration, to have limited damage, or it's been hard for some people? You look at Sean Spicer and many other officials, it's been hard for them to actually get good jobs outside of the administration because of that Trump taint. Yeah. Do they feel like they would do it again? Not in a second term, but just as a personal life choice that they made. So one, and this should be heartening, I think, for us, as it's certainly heartening for me as an American who's spent a lot of time with folks in the administration, but also folks in the intelligence services, in the State Department, in the Pentagon, and in the military. It should be heartening that this country is full of people, and our government is full of people who believe in what they do. And they do it for love of country and not for any particular party. And, they're doing what they believe is the right thing. And that should give us confidence. Now, and many of the folks in his administration who don't agree with his worldview or his way of doing things, and who have also witnessed a whole host of things, not just seat-of-the-pants decision-making, but also, and I get into this in the book as well, questionable motives, right? Whether it be personal interests being equated with or mixed with national interests, and also questionable judgment. This, and I talk about this at length in the book, this affinity for bad guys, right? I mean, the Putin thing is a real thing that his advisors witnessed. So proud, maybe. I think a sense of duty. I think with some of them, frankly, a sense of dread. It's not an exaggeration to say that. You'll see it in this book, in some of the comments on the record. That said, there are true believers. I mean, the book, I spoke to a guy like Navarro in the book, and he believes Trump's doing God's work, right? On these things. So generally, though, I would say, you got folks who
I mean, like you say, know the risks of working in the administration, because when you come out of it, you know, you often got to pay for it, right? But do it because they think it's the right thing to do.
So this week, a guy named Miles Taylor, who was the chief of staff to the Department of Homeland Security, pretty young guy, he came out and endorsed Biden, and he's been on a media tour in the last few days, you know, talking about how damaging all the child separation policies were, and how he felt like Trump was not equipped to be president. But he is the only senior administration official who has so far come out or former official to endorse Biden. Why haven't more of the people you talk to, like the John Boltons of the world, the Fiona Hills, why have they not come out and endorsed, you know, Joe Biden? You talk about H.R. McMaster, Jim Mattis. Are we going to see that in the next couple months?
I think it's different for different ones. I think for some, they want to remain apolitical, right? I don't think Fiona Hill wants to stand up, you know, at the DNC. It's not her style. I think for some of them, frankly, I won't say it by name, it's for preserving a voice within the Republican Party going forward, and possibly a job future, because they do know that, you know, just as you can pay for supporting the president loyally, right? You know, you can also pay for, and we've seen it, standing up to him. And they want to maintain, you know, a professional future, right, in the party. So there is some self-interest, imagine that, in Washington. So I think it's a combination of things. One thing I will say about Taylor's comments, and this is the thing, I actually tweeted this when Trump called him a disgruntled employee, right? Every one of the folks who's come out and criticized this president, Mattis, Kelly, Tillerson, Bolton, Miles Taylor, many of the folks I speak to in this book, Sue Gordon, Joseph Young, etc. If you look at their accounts of this president, they are remarkably consistent, remarkably. They describe, just as I was saying a couple minutes ago, right? They describe a president who's erratic, who makes decisions on the fly, who doesn't like to accept inconvenient information and intelligence, who mixes his own personal interests with the national interest, who imagines, you know, the Miles Taylor quote, you know, that the president quotes these magical authorities that he has. I mean, the president can call them disgruntled employees, coffee boys, crazy, lowlifes, all the various terms he uses. They're all reading from the same playbook about this president. Multiple witnesses, consistent, you know, eyewitness testimony. So, you know, who do you believe, right? It's a very consistent telling of the way this administration operates.
And also, you don't have to have been inside closed door rooms. You can just read his Twitter feed, and you can watch his interviews. So the transparency of the president, I guess, is something to be admired, although one would wish that he would have more moderate rhetoric sometimes and fewer insults. I guess the president said in the 2016 Republican convention that he alone could fix pretty much everything he, you know, put his hands on. And just like in Vladimir Putin's Russia and other countries that have populist leaders, the hyper-personalization of this presidency has definitely been a theme of how the president sees the world, and also just the transactional nature of how he does business. What are the real-world implications that you saw that you uncovered in this book? How does it affect the policymaking apparatus of this government?
There's a great line from Fiona Hill in this book about describing it exactly in those terms, the hyper-personalization of the presidency. And Fiona Hill, so here's this woman who is a student of Russia, who says that Trump's hyper-personalization of the presidency exceeds that of the peak of Putinism, you know? That Trump's more Putin than Putin in terms of making it all about himself. She says that, you know, even at the peak of Putinism in the Kremlin, there was some effort to delegate authority, right? But that under Trump is the policy and the policy is Trump. And she describes how when she was in her position, she would have meetings with high-level counterparts, U.S. allies or, you know, or adversaries, competitors, et cetera. And they would say, why? I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's great, but why do I listen to you when the president is saying something different and might say something different tomorrow, right? it's remarkable that, that the president has taken some of these, he's not authoritarian because our system doesn't allow that. He's definitely done, he'd like to do some stuff, and he's done some stuff that moves it in that direction. But his thinking of the way the job is and how the institution should line up behind him, has a lot in common with those authoritarians. So what does that mean for us? It means that a whole host of things that we took for granted about America's place in the world, and that were shared priorities for Republican and Democratic administrations, I don't know, friendship with allies for decades. I mean, what a radical idea. But the president, it's more than just money with NATO. The president has an issue with NATO. He takes personal offense at the way European leaders talk about him. And it's why when I hear Bolton say he might pull out of NATO, and other folks inside the administration have expressed the same concern to me, that's a real thing. It's not just about money. He's got a bone to pick with them, right? And if it's important to you that this country respects and sees the value in decades-old alliances that have helped keep the peace, right? I mean, simple, crazy ideas like that. This is a president who undermines that. I mean, it's remarkable in how short a period of time he's had people line up behind him too. You have virtually no one in his party challenging that, even though that's been an orthodoxy of the Republican Party, for time immemorial. So it has real consequences. You got to read. I have this back and forth with Peter Navarro on alliances, and we get into, as he's questioning how loyal European allies are to the U.S., and I'm talking about history, etc. So I just throw out, well, what about Canada? And he's like, is Canada really that great an ally? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Let's go back to the beaches of Normandy, right? Or right up to Afghanistan. And I told him, I was like, I've been embedded with U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Canadians were always on the front line, always tip of the spear, no special restrictions about where they would serve, and they paid for it in blood. That's an alliance forged in blood. And he's like, yeah, but do they really do it for us? They do it for their own interests. And it was like, it was a mind-blowing conversation where he's questioning whether Canada is really an ally. And if you're deep into that conversation, then, another 4 years of that, it'll do lasting damage to a lot of things we take for granted.
How effectively do you think the system could check him in, the next 4 years, in terms of the courts, I guess, would continue to have more Trump appointees? Although if there's a Democratic Senate in a second Trump term, then that, he might not be able to actually put as many new judges. Like, do you think there's been a lot of I wouldn't say the term deep state, but the checks and balances seem to have kind of limited some of the stuff that he's tried to do. And even with the Postal Service this week, they had to walk that back because of the public outcry. So how would that look in a second term?
So we'll walk it back a bit, right? We don't know to what extent the changes have already had an effect. Let's see. I mean, there were times where the checks worked, and there were other times where they didn't. Sometimes the greatest check has been incompetence, right? I mean, if you look at it's like the DACA decision they just did a lousy job of repealing DACA. If you read the Supreme Court case on that, and they'll make another go at it. What has struck me about the way his administration operates is that, they never give up, right? Almost to their credit. Look at the Muslim ban, right? Tried 3 or 4 different times, and that's been U.S. policy for 3 years. And it's in the numbers in declines. If it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts at the border, southern border, in terms of immigration there. Transfer of Defense Department funds to build the wall, even though Congress wouldn't give you the money for it, right? I mean, a ratcheting up of various immigration standards using COVID as it to basically carry out Stephen Miller's, goals here, which is to combat not just illegal immigration, but legal immigration. That the checks have worked here and there, but they're pretty good at kind of pushing back, and like over time, you move the ball down the football field. And then you have other instances where the checks have just been dissolved, right? I mean, I think, the ceding of authority that Congress has done, the Senate has basically said, it doesn't matter. We don't have to confirm presidential appointees anymore, right? I mean, they've basically given up on it, haven't they? I mean, it's like so many institutions are led by actings, and you have all this stuff. And yeah, they had a decision against them last week, but I'm generally a hopeful person, and you do see places where the checks have worked, but by and large, disappointing on a number of things. Second time around, you would have a president who feels it's an endorsement of his tactics, right? And therefore, would push harder. A lot depends on what would happen in the Senate for sure. But then if he wins, Republican lawmakers would take that as an endorsement, and then they'd worry about the next primary, and then they'd be less likely to stand up to him. So I don't know. I hate to be pessimistic, but I'm not gleefully optimistic about the way the checks have worked.
One frustration that many people who've worked for the president have had is how he ingests information. It's a lot of TV heavy information sources. And one recent example is how there's questions of whether he actually read the Russian bounty intelligence in the president's daily brief, which we know it was actually in there, but we're unclear on if actually he got to that page or that part of the iPad. Can you walk us through how the president's advisors have adapted to his short attention span and how that has affected his decision making?
I believe he didn't read that intelligence because by all accounts, people I spoke to, he just doesn't read the briefings. He just doesn't read them. And I have a story in the book, probably referencing about how in McMaster's term as national security advisor, his team knew that. So they developed this system of boiling down his national security briefings, right? The briefings on the most essential and severe threats to U.S. national security to note cards with 3 bullet points, because they hoped that he would read at least 3 bullet points, and they try to cram as much key information into those bullet points. Then they discovered over time that he was only reading the first 2 of 3 bullet points. So they started cramming all the relevant necessary information in the first 2, and the third was kind of a throwaway. And then they reached the point where he wasn't reading that. And they could tell, because when they were doing the face-to-face briefings, it would be the first he heard of something dramatic and important. So they knew that he hadn't gotten through it. And that's been, that's continued through his administration. Now, perhaps more disturbing, right, is that even when he is presented with information intelligence, like finally got around to this bounties intelligence with the Russians in Afghanistan, if it's something he doesn't want to believe or is inconvenient to his public positions, he will trash it, right? I mean, look at last week, we had the intel agency's report again that Russia's interfering again to help him. There's not a single discussion of that. He doesn't tweet out or call up Putin and say, don't mess with it, and hasn't done that for 4 years, in the midst of the North Korea negotiations. And I went to all 3 summits as the intel agencies were assessing, no, they will not give up their nuclear weapons. It's a survival thing for them. The president would dismiss that. No, through personal diplomacy, I'll move it. I'll move the ball here. It didn't work. In the Iran deal, right? The intel agencies were assessing that Iran was complying with the deal, and the president and even Pompeo said publicly no. So, even when he does receive or see that information, if it doesn't fit with what he wants or hopes or is seeking, he'll dismiss it as well. And that's a pretty worrisome phenomenon.
So during a few years in the Obama administration, you were the chief of staff to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. What did that job teach you about the challenges faced by people in public life and government, and how did it change your approach to covering people in power? Are you more sympathetic towards the frustrations of those types of jobs? It
was really helpful to me in my job as a reporter, because understanding the way things work or frankly don't work on the inside, right, of any administration is helpful as you're speaking to people and trying to assess and dig on these policy moves and national security challenges, et cetera. I think it also gave me certainly a sense, again, and I'd seen this, but you see it more firsthand. There are a lot of good people, right, in government. They're trying to do their best. but also it pierces this idea that government knows everything, and that there's a set way of doing everything in a smart way, right? I mean, it's you got imperfect people trying to make decisions with imperfect information and often getting it wrong. Sometimes getting it right, but often getting it wrong. And it's interesting because I tell a story in the book about being in the embassy in Beijing when the embassy took in the blind dissident Chen Guangchen. If folks remember this, this was in 2012. This was a dramatic move for the U.S. to do in the midst of what was then, and even more so now, a very tense relationship, to take in a prisoner of the Chinese government. He escaped house arrest, and give him protection. It was remarkable, and I was there as it happened, and I saw him in the embassy, and it was a proud moment for the diplomats who were working there to say, here, okay, we as a country are doing the right thing. We're standing up for our values here. But then I watched over the course of days how the priority shifted from providing protection to, let's find a way out of this because this is really messing things up here, and we got some trade negotiations coming up, et cetera. And that was disappointing to me as a diplomat, as an American too. And I tell that story in the book in part to explain my own reaction of the president's approach to China, which in many ways was overdue, right? On Chinese cheating on trade deals, theft of U.S. intellectual property, national security secrets, et cetera. Now, where that's gotten us today is another discussion, but it also has informed my view of Trump's China policy. The truth is, when you look at the president's foreign policy, it is scattershot. There are real questions about the president's loyalties, decision-making, et cetera. But on China, and it's not just China, but on China, there was a sense of an overdue change in the way the U.S. Approaches that relationship, a change that the previous Republican and Democratic administrations wouldn't do.
Before we go back to China, how do you think the media has done in terms of covering this administration? What shortfalls or shortcomings and successes would you say that we in the media have kind of done our jobs? Because I'm sure there's some people who have kind of unplugged from watching everything and reading everything because it often feels repetitive, and it feels like there's too much of a focus on the outrageous thing that Trump said 5 minutes ago or tweeted, when he's saying a lot of things, and that issues and policy follow-up sometimes get lost and are not as sexy as his tweets.
So I'll start with criticism. I think we could have and still could do a better job at scale, right? That not everything is a 5-alarm fire. Some things are a 1-alarm fire, and some things are just BS. Not every tweet, every threat, every crisis is that severe, and a lot of it is self-generated, right? I mean, this is the Trump model. It's a constant churn of just controversy, keeping himself in the news. Some of it, one story from the Bolton book I loved was the idea that one reason he publicly exonerated the Saudis in Khashoggi's killing was to draw attention away from Ivanka's use of a personal email system. It's like, it's amazing.
We fall into his traps, basically.
We do. I think we do. And we don't give our viewers, readers, listeners, everybody's got a limit. And that I feel like if we had a better sense of scale, say, okay, this is a really big deal. Here's why it matters to you. This is not as big a deal. And by the way, other stuff happened today, right? That's not Trump related. That's just me. And I think we all kind of struggle with that a bit, how to get it right. What we've done well, I think keeping at it, right? I mean, it has been an unprecedented assault on media in the US. And that's a straight up strategy that the president said in so many words in that Leslie Stahl interview in December 2016, when she asked him, why do you attack the press? And he said, if you do something critical of me, then I'll make people question it, right? I mean, this is an example of Trump, being transparent. And so it's with intent, and it's worked for a lot of people. There are portions of this country who believe that, the MSM, mainstream media, is all against Trump and fake news and blah, blah, blah. But so we've kept at it, and some of the threats real, in terms of violence, and a lot of us get death threats, and, CNN got mailed a bunch of bombs, and, so keeping at it, and I think also learning over time to fact check in real time that the president does lie, and you can't recoil or hesitate to call that out and explain to people why that's true. And I'm not one of those people who thinks like, it's all falling apart, because again, if you look in the polling, folks still, they believe Fauci well over the president, right? They know the president's not telling the truth. So some of this is getting through, right? It's not like everybody's not wise to it,
And how do you think the norm, if there's a Joe Biden administration, how do you think the norms of how the government would interact with the media, does everything go back to normal, or do you think they will continue to keep some of the tactics, even if they're a little bit more moderated?
It's a good question, because I'll tell you, I've had this experience, I wonder if you do too, that far left social media can be as angry and critical as far right social media. Like if you do a story or have a comment on Twitter that doesn't fit, a narrative or something, you will often get, you'll get fire, from that side too. And you could see, as past administrations have attacked the media before when they don't think it's being fair to them. It's just the degree and extent, enormous qualitative difference, but a degree and extent of the way the Trump administration does it. I don't know, it's interesting. Would you have, if in a Biden-Harris administration and there's a big investigative piece that discovers wrongdoing, right? Would part of the tactic be, this is a hit job? I don't know. It'd be interesting to know. I think that a lot of things would sort of return a little bit to the center, but a lot of this is also technological change, the way people get their news. You'll still have a big portion of the country that lives in a right-wing bubble and therefore would have a totally different view of the way a Biden-Harris administration is operating than from folks who live in the mirror image of that bubble.
And I think, one difference would be how he announces news. Joe Biden, unclear if he actually writes any of his tweets himself. Yeah. That would be a good story. We should, I claim first dibs on that, because with Trump, there's no question that he is writing almost all of the incendiary ones. And only one other person, Dan Scavino, his social media director, has access to his account. And Joe Biden's tweets, I think, get probably 10 people are approving, every one. And so I think they'll leak to the New York Times, the Washington Post, when they have significant policy announcements, like what happened in the, in the Obama and Bush administration. So that's that's something that we should probably,
and you see some of that in this campaign cycle, right? That you do have the Biden campaign reaching out to media that you normally wouldn't be the first line, right? Like where their first interviews, because again, there's been such a diffusion of the way people get their news. So I think some of that some of those changes will endure. I absolutely agree.
Maybe in like 20 years, if there's an AOC administration, then she would probably return to the announcing stuff on Twitter, since natural of that. Going back to kind of China, almost all of the DC foreign policy establishment now has kind of recognized that China is the #1 foreign policy challenge facing America. If in the Biden administration, how much continuity should we expect from the tough Trump-China policies? And what do you see as the future of the relationship, given that President Xi wants to be dictator for life?
One thing that's pretty certain is you will not have a return to the status quo under a Biden-Harris administration. That there is fair bipartisan agreement that China is a bad actor on many fronts, and that the past deference doesn't work, and that that China has effectively played international institutions like the WTO, et cetera, to their advantage. So that then it becomes a question of degree and what's the approach, right? What's the approach to correcting that? you know, a Biden-Harris administration more likely to bring in allies, right, to help push this, which, I mean, you could argue, I mean, what seems pretty straightforward would probably help your case. Maybe a resurrection of the TPP as a means of doing that, right? Getting Asian players to help, put more financial pressure on China. Maybe less of a reliance on tariffs, right? As the sole means of doing that, because of the damage that causes to U.S. To U.S. importers and consumers, frankly. So that's more like the tactics. The overall strategy probably the same, but the tactics being different. The real worry is, has this administration set the U.S. and China on such a course of conflict that it'll be hard to pull it back, at least away from the brink, right? Now, I mean, the potential flashpoints have really multiplied here. I mean, you've got Hong Kong, you've got activity around Taiwan, the South China Sea, in addition to the trade stuff. And you have a strident China and a strident Xi Jinping and a strident Chinese public, that views this relationship differently now, and frankly views the U.S. as weaker today than it was 4 years ago. This idea that, I'm very skeptical of the idea that China, doesn't want Trump to be reelected, because there are many Chinese who see him as an advantage because he's undermined the U.S. system as a model, for the world. And I talk about this in my book, that Chinese politicians openly talk now about surpassing the U.S. many years earlier than they used to. That's under a Trump administration.
Do you see any hope that China will become a freer country in our lifetimes? And how would that happen, given that China's integration into the global trade market has not resulted in their adherence to a rules-based system and agreed upon norms of behavior on the world stage?
Not under Xi's leadership, right? I mean, he has a very aggressive and view of Chinese power and its future going forward. And you've seen China restrict further rather than less over the last several years. I mean, the most underreported story, I think, of the last 5 years is the concentration camps for 1 million Muslims in northwestern China. I mean, the fact that this is happening in the 21st century is just sickening, and China just stole Hong Kong, right? I mean, it just violated an international treaty. Hong Kong is a free and fair one country, two systems. It's over. It's over. It's going to be a Chinese city. That kind of dream that China's economic modernization would lead to political liberalization, dead. The only thing that changes that would be a radically new leader. And it's hard to see how the Chinese system of producing leaders creates that. And she's going to be around for a while, or some sort of like popular revolution. But China is so good at repression. They're so good at it at every level, down to the micro level of technology. If I WhatsApp message you some sort of politically, dangerous message, they'll know about it. It's just hard to see that happen.
And there's many other countries that sometimes go from repressed to free, especially as they get richer. Is it, what specifically about China has led to that not happening?
One, I think they're just better at it, right? And I don't want to, listen, if you or I were sitting here talking about Iran in 1979, we're like, the Shah's got this, he's got this under control. I mean, people have been, or the King of Russia in 1917, can't see him stepping down. You know what I'm saying? Like history has taught us that, surprises come. But it's just, the government, I spent a couple years there in government and a lot of years there as a reporter. They're just very good at it. Now, I will say, what's China's fear? China's fear is economic weakness, because they know if they, this whole thing is built on constantly improving the lot of the Chinese people. And if you can't do that, then Chinese people aren't dumb. And They don't tolerate a government that's screwing them. You've seen that in like Wuhan, early stage of the virus. It was like the people and the doctors who exposed this. They're like, you can't tell me nothing's happening here. So, if a major, they live in fear, right? Chinese leadership lives in fear of that kind of popular dissatisfaction and works to, but they're not God. So, they'll screw up and have screwed up. And at some point, maybe to the point where people get the upper hand, but it's just, they're so good at repression. That's why I'm skeptical.
Trump once tweeted after meeting with Kim Jong-un that North Korea was, quote, no longer a nuclear threat. But since he took office, North Korea's gained more than 10 military nuclear warheads from 20 to 30, and his personal diplomacy hasn't gone anywhere. Is there anything that can be done in the next 4 years to bring the North into the community of nations, or are we going to have to be forced to accept a nuclear-armed North Korea for the foreseeable future that starves its own people?
It's the clearest failure of Trump's foreign policy, right? I mean, he went all in. He was told and he agreed, by Obama coming in, North Korea is your biggest national security threat, most immediate. Trump agreed, did a year of fire and fury, nearly brought the US and North Korea to war. I tell the story of that in the book. I'll get to that in a second. And then 3 years of personal diplomacy, throwing all of his personal capital in. And it failed. And as you say, and this is in the final chapter of the book, before and after, they have more nukes, they have a more advanced ballistic missile program, they've got a greater capability of miniaturizing the nukes and putting them on the top of the ballistic missiles. So it's a failure. I also talk in the book about how the president was convinced he was going to win a Nobel Peace Prize for North Korea, and that was really driving his thinking. I mean, that thought is gone.
Although he still wants the Nobel Peace Prize after the UAE deal.
Yes, that's the new one. That plus Rushmore, right? This is the thing where the hyper-personalization of the presidency and the hyper-personalization of the policy. The North Korea policy was built almost entirely, diplomacy, on Trump's, love affair, charm offensive with Kim, right? And the US made a lot of concessions in the midst of that North Korea did not, against the advice of Trump's advisors, like canceling exercises with South Korea, et cetera. And it didn't, I asked this question in the book and try to answer it, but who played who? And it looks like Kim played Trump. And Trump wouldn't be the first president, because Democrats and Republicans before him tried as well and didn't get anywhere. But it's a pretty clear-cut fail when it comes to that.
And that's in large part because Kim Jong-un knows that he is much more secure in power with nuclear weapons, right?
Yes. I mean, that was the intel read from the very beginning, right? Is that they will not completely denuclearize because they look at it as a matter of survival. And this is the thing, and gets to the point in 2017, late 2017, which I talk about in the book, when, we were on the brink of war, that the president had this idea, again, against the advice of his advisors, that there could be a bloody nose strike, a limited military engagement that would force North Korea to the table and to concede. No one in the Pentagon believed that was true, because North Korea would read a quote unquote limited strike as the beginning of a decapitation strike and then rain hell down on Seoul. The military intel assessments of what the death toll of a limited engagement would be was in the tens of thousands of dead in Seoul, right? South Koreans, Americans, their families, you have so many living there and working there and stationed there. And that's why, and I tell the story in the book, that his advisors held back military options from him because they were concerned he might use them. It's just such a telling example of where his most senior advisors didn't trust his decision-making in the midst of a crisis.
And Trump has also promised that if he's reelected, he'll have a deal with Iran within, quote, 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Which it would be a very short negotiating session. But if Biden is elected, how difficult will it be for him to revive President Obama's Iran deal that President Trump has ripped up? Is it kind of, they have to start from scratch, or what do you there's these snapback sanctions that are being implemented today. What do you see as happening in that corner of the world?
So, Biden needs to be pressed in the debates what his plan would be for Iran. Does he get all the parties back to the table and say, let's do 2015 JCPOA redux. Would he do that? It's the U.S.-Iran dynamic is not quite like the U.S.-China dynamic in that, the U.S.-China dynamic has clearly shifted over here and there's bipartisan agreement. We can't go back to where we were. It'd be pretty tough politically for a President Biden, Harris to come in and say, we're going to go back to the negotiating table on Iran because, Iran's been up to a lot of no good, right? So what's the tactic there to get them back into a program? You could start negotiations again, maybe seek more concessions, but then what's Iran's take on this? They want the financial relief, but their view will be, we signed a deal, you guys pulled out after one election. What happened? I signed this deal, then what happens in the next election, right? And beyond just that one deal, it does raise bigger questions for any country that signs an agreement with the U.S., even one like that was multilateral. Our politics are so divided. Does this pendulum that we see in this country affect not just domestic policy but international policy? If we're going to be swinging back and forth like this, what does it mean for the possibility of negotiating any similar agreement? It's an open question.
And another hot topic is Russia, and NBC News reported over the weekend that Trump wants to meet again with Vladimir Putin before the election, which I don't think is going to happen. And a lot of people still wonder 4 or 5 years later why Trump seems to have such an affinity for Putin and other strongmen. He seems to respect them and their strength. What's your best theory about this? And will Russia's meddling in every election just be a fact of life going forward? You don't see them in 2024 not, saying we're not going to meddle anymore.
Yeah. Well, let's start with something we know. The president does not stand up to Russia. He doesn't. It's in his public comments. They interfered in 2016, didn't stand up, arguably welcomed it, right? And I would recommend everybody here just read, you don't have to read the whole report, but read the Senate Intel Committee report because it's pretty alarming. Here we are 4 years later, Russia's interfering again to benefit him and he's not standing up to them. He will not stand up to them even on bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, not just, this latest information, but going back to 2018, he in effect gave him a free pass on selling arms to the Taliban in 2018 to kill U.S. soldiers. This idea that, no one's tougher on Russia than Trump is just belied by the facts. Slow rolling sanctions passed by large majorities of Congress. The record is one where he doesn't stand up to it. Okay, so let's get to the motivation. All these moves defy all of his advisors, stated U.S. policy, and large bipartisan majorities in Congress. It is he is a island of one on this, accommodating approach, hopeful approach. And there is, Fiona Hill talks about this in the book. He does have an idea of some grand nuclear agreement with Iran, with Russia, which he brings up sometime. But he is an island of one with a deferential approach to Russia. So why is it? The best explanation, and I asked everybody I interviewed for this book, why, is he has an inexplicable admiration for Vladimir Putin. He admires the man. Look at the letter. If you saw the letters released in the Senate Intel Committee report, he admires the man. He envies the power that Putin has. And he shares a nihilistic view of the world with Putin. This, one of the chapters in my book is the end of American exceptionalism. The president sees the world in very antiseptic terms, right? Of just, we're all dirty players in a dirty game. And the U.S. know better than Russia. And he kind of respects that that's the way Putin sees the world and that's the way Trump sees the world. That interview with Bill O'Reilly early in his term when O'Reilly says Putin's a killer and he says, well, are we any better? A couple of weeks ago around the time of the Afghan story, the president was pressed on Russia selling the Taliban arms in 2018 to kill U.S. soldiers, mind you. And the president said, well, we sold the Taliban arms in the 80s, making no distinction between the way the two countries operate. Now, that's a pretty remarkable view of the world for a sitting U.S. president. Step further is that view of Putin affected Trump's view of the world and Trump's decision making. One of the folks I spoke to in the book, used the phrase, Putin is Trump's honey trap, right? Honey trap, like, the beautiful woman in the bar in the John le Carré novel who tries to influence you and get you to do things for the other side, right? I mean, it's mind blowing to hear. U.S. intel, this is also in the book, was concerned about Russia recruiting Trump, in effect, not as a formal special agent, but recruiting them as part of an influence operation. An influence operation in espionage is me using pressure, using friendly relationships, using offers of business deals, etc., to influence the way you see the world and the kinds of decisions you make. And that's a remarkable way to have your own intelligence service describe what's going on there. And his own advisors described instances where the president seemed to be influenced by Putin's view of the world. They said that one of his sources of hostility to Western European leaders, NATO allies like Angela Merkel, et cetera, is Putin. They kind of talk about it and kind of shares that view. She's not that great. She's causing trouble there. This whole NATO thing, well, why do we really need it? It's, you shake your head and it sounds conspirational, but this is coming from folks who work for him. And then you look at the record of his decision making. The withdrawal of troops from Germany, no one in his administration recommended that, and no one on the Hill supported that. This was the president and island of one once again. And we talked earlier about folks kind of standing in the way, trying to slow roll, etc. But he's the commander in chief, and it takes a while to get those troops out if there's an election change, in November. But as of today, those troops are leaving.
I'm talking about decision-making of one in terms of national security policy. The National Security Council is supposed to convene a policy-making process to decide on foreign and national security policies. That's still the case in the NSC now under Robert O'Brien. And what are the differences in style and substance between O'Brien, who loves appearing on TV these days, versus John Bolton and H.R. McMaster?
Well, let's see. The National Security Council still exists. They have meetings. They put out national defense strategies, et cetera. But the president's the policy. Oftentimes that decision-making follows the decision rather than precedes the decision. He tweets out, we're withdrawing from Syria. Then you create the policy afterwards. He decides summarily, I want the troops out of Europe, and they follow up. Not like there was a long debate leading up to that about the pros and cons and how this fits with our bigger picture. And that's another takeaway from this book, right, is really the destruction of the national security policymaking. It doesn't, in terms of its effectiveness and relevance, it doesn't really exist anymore. You could put out 1,000 position papers on the national defense strategy, but if you contradict those with your decisions and statements, what do they mean? Not to say that it doesn't happen anywhere, but it's all provisional if the president changes his mind, and then they just hope he changes his mind again or loses interest. So that's, that has real consequences long term. How do you stand that up again? Now, a lot of folks have said the NSC got too big, and it did, as you know. I'm sure you've dealt with people there. It's become this behemoth, but it still performs a function, or should perform a function, but under this president, it was just sidelined and remains largely sidelined.
Who do you think has more credibility, O'Brien or Secretary of State Mike Pompeo?
In the current environment, for now, probably both of them, but from covering this administration, that could turn on a dime, right? You're only as good as your last yes. Esper was, it didn't take long for Esper to be on the hot seat, right? It's like, it's such a familiar pattern, right? Once you stand in the way or slow roll something or criticize in some way, the whispers start, and then before you know it, you're gone. So O'Brien and Pompeo have been on the right side, and Pompeo has a powerful position in that he's kind of leading the charge on China, and he's sort of chosen to focus his energies there. And I'm sure you've talked to Pompeo. I've been talking to him for years, and China has been a priority for him for years, so it kind of makes sense. You're only as good as your last interaction, right, with the president.
And the people watching our interview are likely not the biggest Trump fans, given how liberal the Berkshires are. But you do have a section in your book on, Trump's successes. What do you see as some of the things that he has done that have led to good outcomes in foreign policy, and conversely, after that, what do you see as his, the biggest negative legacy that he leave behind?
So I think the long delayed change in the relationship and approach to China, right? That this was a long time coming, and I wrote a lot about this in my last book, actually, The Shadow War. But that you had this, for decades under Republicans and Democrats, this idea that China will just change over time, engage as they liberalize economically, it'll all work out politically. And it's just like, even as it was clear it wasn't happening, folks just stayed in that kind of mindset. So changing that necessary. The concern right now is the temperature is being turned up so high and so fast, danger of miscalculation and, tripping into some sort of larger conflict. And given the way this administration makes decisions, we should watch that somewhat warily. The UAE deal with Israel wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. We wouldn't be talking about that. So that's a success. I think in terms of failures, North Korea, pretty clear cut. Iran, okay, you've gotten tougher on Iran, but Iran is closer to, not further away from a nuclear weapon, which was your intention, right? Was to, the president's stated intention was to make it less likely Iran would march the bomb, and you've moved them closer by pulling out of that deal. What did you accomplish there? It's also mitigated your ability to negotiate a deal like it with an Iran or a North Korea going forward, right? Because the whole, if Trump had come out of one of those summits with something like the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, relaxation of sanctions, inspectors from the IAEA and their cameras in North Korea nuclear facilities, he and we would have called that a victory. But he blew that deal up. So what's the incentive for North Korea or the next one to make that deal? So that's pretty clear cut. I think that the bigger one is just a questioning of America's very vision of itself in the world. What does the U.S. stand for, right? Does it stay loyal to friends and allies? Does it still stand up for human rights as a priority? What has the president said about Belarus? Nothing. He said to Xi Jinping, it's okay to incarcerate 1 million Muslims, right? It's, those things are more lasting, because you can sit down at a table and renegotiate a deal, right? Shift a policy, pull back military assets, move some forward, but trust is easily lost, difficult to gain.
I have one more question before we turn back to Lisa to moderate audience questions. According to various surveys, America is less well respected around the world now than when Trump took office. If Biden's elected president in November, do you expect America's global standing and leadership to bounce back pretty quickly? Everyone said after 8 years of George W. Bush that America's reputation was gone forever, and Barack Obama seemed to get that back pretty quickly.
Well, he did, and then it was then it was like, okay, what are you going to do with it, right? And I was overseas during that change in leadership, and I remember the initial outpouring of excitement, and then they're like, wait a second, well, that didn't work out. So I think that the impression can change very quickly, but then it becomes, okay, what are you going to do with it? And people begin to look at, okay, how are you going to, what is your plan for NATO? How are you going to negotiate with North Korea, right? Then it will turn to the record pretty quickly, I think.
Well, thank you, Jim, for a great conversation. And back to Lisa.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Daniel, for grilling me so gentlemanly-like.
Try my best.
All right, so thank you all. We have so many great questions, but I just want everyone to see the book one more time, because this is really an amazing book. And also I want you to know that it's available as a physical book. It's available as an ebook, and Jim recorded the audiobook. So you can drive around and listen to Jim, or, if people aren't commuting as much these days. But I want to go right to the questions. We have so many great questions. And the first question is about China. This is from Stephen. he says that for all of the adversaries to the U.S., it is the most potent, but what can be done to repair our relationship? China has aligned itself with countries we once traded with in Asia. In time of conflict, these trade partners of China will certainly pay allegiance to China. What can we do now to strengthen our relationship with other countries in Asia?
It was interesting. In the time I was in the embassy and since then, there was this interesting dynamic that, Southeast Asian countries and so on, what they kind of wanted the status quo, right? They didn't want to be beaten up by China. And China does that with folks. It likes to make things unilateral so that they can kind of like dominate. And they liked the US as a counterbalance to China, but they didn't want it to like tilt into open conflict. They wanted, somewhere in the middle, some sort of balance there. So, and this has been one of the, the downsides of the president's approach, right? Is that instead of, strength in numbers, it's been the opposite, right? Dumping out of the TPP summarily, which was a US priority, and just going it alone, right? So, that's been a weakness in the approach. And now as things teeter towards something more volatile, folks in the region don't want that either. So it's, the approach would be, I suppose, get your allies on your side, right? And kind of do it together. But, keep in mind that they have relationships with China too, which they don't want to burn entirely.
So this one is a little bit off topic, but I like it. This is from Kim Brown. She needs to know what CNN's take is on Trump's love for CNN, haha. And why do you think the press displays such patience when he goes off, especially against you guys, whom he has often called fake news and the enemy of the people?
Yeah. Ooh, patience. That's an interesting word. I think, listen, we've been more, you probably watch this in which press conferences of the presidents we take and we don't take. And we have it's been a tough balance. I mean, he is the president, but oftentimes he uses that bully pulpit either to make campaign speeches or to lie, right? And mislead. So it's become a difficult editorial decision to make in the moment. When do you air it? When do you not air it? And then also, how aggressively you fact check. I think over time, I was saying this to Daniel earlier, we've become more aggressive and more immediate in the fact checking. That's not true. Watch the banner. President says X when in that fact X is, not true. These are all adjustments we've been making to try to handle a president who is so aggressively misleading in many circumstances. Why does he pick on CNN in particular? Although he targets a lot of folks. If I had to guess, I think a little has to do with Jeff Zucker, right? And their past relationship. So, yeah. But he also likes to have a bugbear. He likes to have someone to hit. And we just got Joe. Our coverage was, we were tough on him early because we broke some news early, and I think it just got into, we lucked into the position of being his favorite, and we were not alone, right? I mean, failing New York Times, et cetera, but we lucked into being his favorite. Target.
Mary Dixon wants to know, where do you think Trump gets these seat of the pants ideas? Are they phone calls with his friends, or does he just get them right off of Fox News?
Well, the Fox News thing is a real channel of information. I mean, I tell the story in here, and I think the Times had this too around the time, but that, when the president pulled back, remember when Iran shot down that drone over international waters, and the planes were in the air to retaliate. President said it was because he got an assessment that there was danger to Iranian personnel on the ground. He thought that it was not a reciprocal retaliation. Fact is, that assessment would have been front-loaded into any discussion of military options. The story is he spoke to Tucker Carlson, and Tucker Carlson told him, you were elected to get out of wars in the Middle East, and if you start a war with Iran, you will deep six your chances for re-election. So that this phenomenon of people in his ear, I talk about this a lot in the book, his advisors are like, they describe this as a sort of behemoth, folks who are in his ear, the My Pillow guy, folks he speaks to from real estate in New York, Fox News people, and they influence his decision. And he believes their view of the world often more than the experts, whether it be on Russia or North Korea, or say on a pandemic, right? A lot of these, it's remarkable.
I mean, that new meaning to the word pillow talk, right?
Yeah.
So Wendy D. Griswold wants to know, does he make these erratic decisions because he can't actually think through the consequences of his actions?
Susan Gordon, who was second highest ranking intel official in the country, she was going to be director of national intelligence. He forced her out because he didn't consider her sufficiently loyal enough, his woman in intel. She talks about his supreme overconfidence, right? And what's remarkable, not only does he trust his own judgment over others, but he trusts his own facts and information. So he just thinks he knows better. He's a gut guy, my gut's right. And he will often punish folks who tell him one thing and then he feels like he got it right and they didn't. And Sue Gordon tells a story too. And this is one that, helps form his view of things. But you remember the moving of the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem early in his term. The intel read going into that was, if you do this, you're going to have weeks, months of rage in the region. You're going to have terror attacks. It's going to really blow up the situation on the ground. And relationships, and that Arab powers are going to come together, and the whole 9 yards. President went ahead, and that didn't happen. And Sue Gordon describes him saying, "You guys told me this. You don't know what you're talking about." And that after that first year, he was further emboldened. He's like, "I know better than you guys," And now there are a lot of instances where he was flat out wrong, and he sort of very quickly forgets those too. So the overconfidence, doesn't waver. And I think it's, a lot of it is that he's got a tremendous belief in himself and his judgment.
Paul Gluck wants to know, how does Trump's worldview align with Prime Minister, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's? Where are they similar and where are they different?
So Johnson's fine. I mean, listen, they're both sort of in the populist camp, right? You can say the way they ran. Johnson. Well, they're both opportunistically populist, right? I mean, neither one of them. I mean, come on, Johnson's like an Oxford boy. I mean, he's super British privilege, as is the billionaire property developer from New York, right? Who kind of have for political gain, kind of wrap themselves in sort of the working man, working white man, right? With a hostility towards immigration, that kind of thing. It's interesting on the pandemic, right? That both of them had a similar kind of skeptical response to the pointy-headed smart people who were saying, we had to do all this kind of stuff. And you remember, UK was going for herd immunity. Then the prime minister got sick, and their approach changed. Be interesting to know what would happen to our own president. But they do, the politics really inform their decision making. But Johnson just doesn't take it to the degree. For instance, on inviting Putin to the G7, right? Again, Trump on an island there. The UK was like, no, that ain't going to happen. So there are ways where Trump goes further than Johnson.
Marlene is asking, how have members of the Trump administration that you've spoken to changed over the course of the administration, i.e., were some skeptical and then became true believers, or were some excited and positive only to then leave demoralized? Well, I'm sure that's happened, yes.
Yeah, a lot. Well, the only way, it's like the mob, right? you either go to jail or it's you either get pushed out or you leave. Mattis resigned after the first Syria withdrawal. Sue Gordon got pushed out. She wanted to be director of national intelligence under Trump. She wanted to serve on the administration. She gets pushed out. John Bolton, he says he left. Trump says he fired him. There are really no good endings to, Nikki Haley's probably the only one who left with kind of like some sort of relationship intact and that kind of thing. So,
or Sarah.
What's that?
Sarah Huckabee Sanders as well.
Well, exactly. Good point. Yeah.
And Dina Powell, the deputy national security advisor.
You're right. Okay, fair enough. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule, right? Because the by and large, you go out, the Jeff Sessions way, through a slow death of 1,000 cuts, and then do some of them change over time? Based on the folks I've spoken to, I wonder if Daniel has, met folks who become more confident in the president and his decision-making over time in the administration. I haven't found that. I do find people that are true believers and are just more likely to stick with the plan. I do know that even some of the loyalists that I interviewed for this book believe the president's, phase 1 trade deal with China was a capitulation, right? Surrender, so that even the folks who stick with it have questions about his decision-making. So by and large, the trend is less confidence over time if you were to kind of plot that on a chart.
Lee Easter is asking, do you think he will use the provisions in place and become a dictator? Now, there was a really scary Ted Koppel report on CBS Sunday Morning about these little known hidden things in the Constitution that would allow him to perhaps do something like that.
Listen, he believes, he'll do what he could get away with, right? I mean, it's the way he's led his life on a thousand different things. And he does believe that the institution should line up behind him, right? That the Justice Department should prosecute your enemies and relieve your friends. That if Congress doesn't, as it is constitutionally required to do, allocate money, find it somewhere else. I mean, he's been able to do that on the wall. If the military won't send active military to respond to protests, then find a friendly acting director of another agency to do it anyway. So it is the way he views a whole range of leverage. I mean, the courts, by the way, they're his judges, right? They're his court. Wait, I appointed them. Why didn't they rule with me on LGBTQ rights? And so, he won't announce it in a day. And I do believe that there are still checks that would stand even under those circumstances, but he wants those kinds of powers. And he constantly, he says it in his public statements, right? I have endless power on X, right? He believes it, and he'll do what he could get away with.
Back to Asia for a moment, and Vanessa Wassener is asking, how can Biden make a significant change to what's happened in Hong Kong? Does the potential loss of international investment make a difference?
I sadly don't see how you turn Hong Kong around, and it's hard to see what a different president might have done in those circumstances. China just made a decision, and it's done. China jettisoned an international agreement, right? I mean, this was an agreement with the British going back to 1997. So now it'd be interesting to see, here's the thing. It also belies the Trump point that China now respects the US in a way that it didn't before, right? Because that's a major power grab there. I don't see, sadly, how you turn it around. China, strident leader who believes that, they have the right to stifle dissent there and even arrest, newspaper owners like Jimmy Lai. Over time, there'll probably be financial loss as a result of it, that companies over time will figure out that, Hong Kong's, one of its big attractions was rule of law, right? And if you make deals and businesses there, you're not. Now, right now, I was talking to someone today out in Hong Kong who was saying, well, the businesses are they kind of see some advantage here because there aren't all these protesters in the street. I was like, yeah, wait until China puts one of your executives under house arrest, which China did to foreign executives when I was in Beijing. If there's a business deal, if you get on the wrong side of a business deal with a state-owned enterprise, okay, if you're Unilever in Hong Kong and that happens to one of your executives, you're going to recalculate about where you want your business,
Speaking of China, Nancy wants to know, and you touched on this a little bit with Daniel, but how close do you think China is to being the world leader and displacing the United States?
So China's goal was to displace the US by 2049, 100 years since the founding of the Communist Party, victory, etc. In their public statements and so on, they've moved up that date in recent years, including under Trump. They talk about it in the late 2020s, 2030. That's their ambition. And, a lot of it is back, they believe that they have the ability to do that. Now, let's not overestimate China, because China has its own issues. It does. It's got a massive internal debt problem. It has a big aging problem, and that it's reaching that Japan problem of too many old people, not enough young people to pay for them far earlier in the kind of wealth curve. So it's got issues. So I don't want to overestimate that, but we have issues too, right? And a lot will be proven over the next several years. Who could solve big problems better? Who can, compete in these new spheres, which are becoming new areas of competition? Cyber warfare, right? Who's going to dominate the next round of technology, right? 5G is just one front. This battle over Huawei, et cetera, because Huawei is already thinking about 6 and 7G. Who's leading the way on artificial intelligence? China has the lead on that. So there are so many fronts in the battle. It's not certain, but we don't want to look at China as 12 feet tall, right? Because they have their issues as well.
This is a lovely one. Somebody is saying, first of all, what a pleasure to hear you speak in this format. I just ordered the book. Thank you. And everyone out there watching should do that immediately. This person has a sort of personal question. Would we, the people out here watching, love to hear you and your fellow journalists talk amongst yourselves? I know I would, they say. And are you exhausted by the rapidity of the news cycle, as are we? And they're also saying without all of you, they would truly be in the dark, so thank you. So are you exhausted, and what do you talk about with your journalists?
Who was the questioner on that?
I'm not sure.
No, I was just going to thank by name. So first of all, thank you for buying the book, and thank you for the good words about the work that journalists like Daniel and I are doing. And then I will say, it's like, in the midst of the kind of craziness, I do get stopped on the street a lot, and people are like, "Thanks so much for what the news is doing," and which is nice to hear. And it's not like, there are a million of us out there. It's nice to hear that folks are listening, right? That you feel like your work matters to some degree. So that's nice to hear, and I really do appreciate it. It makes a big difference. So listen, I was thinking about this because I'm an optimist by nature, right? And I believe in my country, and I believe in the people in our country. And we've seen so many, even in the midst of all the bad stuff we've witnessed, right? We've seen so many moments of strength and resilience and generosity and bravery, right? Just in the last few months and over time, and that gives me confidence. What I worry about is the kind of structural stuff, right? That makes it hard to solve problems, right? Can we sit down and pass legislation that corrects some of these issues anymore, given the division in the politics? And I worry about that. I worry about, disinformation works. That's one thing we've seen in this. If you look, like CNN had a poll out today, Republicans by and large think the COVID crisis is exaggerated. Democrats do not. Republicans less likely to take steps to control it. So that that stuff doesn't just make for uncomfortable dinner conversations, right? It affects how we solve problems, and that's what worries me. Anyway, I don't know if I answered the question, but a little stream of consciousness there.
Well, no, but it was a great question from a great person. So Nancy would like to know, and I think everyone would like to know this, what is your take on Trump's charge that China is responsible for the virus and unleashed it?
So in fact, I was talking to someone today about this. There is really no evidence that this was like an intentional release or sort of a weaponization, right? There is some questioning about, this lab, right, in Wuhan, and whether there was an accidental release. There's a lot of research that went on there on coronaviruses. So that path, as opposed to a path from a wet market, right? But not hard evidence of that. Just, it's something of an open possibility. It's also true that early on, China did downplay this, try to hide it from its own people, right? And a lot of this is in the public reporting, right? That it was doctors who were sounding the alarm there early on, and those doctors were getting silenced, until it switched, and then China realized it had a problem. Also realized, this goes back to what I was talking earlier about Chinese people aren't dumb. They also realized they had a problem on their hand, because if they were stuffing the doctors who were trying to handle this, people would revolt, So they turned it around and turned those doctors into heroes, and then finally got on top of it. So there was definitely delays in information sharing and all that kind of stuff. So, but I don't believe, based on my reporting, that this was intentional because they were doing damage to their own country. But they did certainly delay early on. Now, we should also say that once they figured out it was a real problem, they got on top of it, right? And successfully controlled an outbreak by taking the steps that every public health expert says you have to do. Test, contact, trace, isolate, right? And that's something that we as a country just have never done nationally. The president doesn't want to do it, and it doesn't appear we're ever going to do it.
So I know that we are going up against the clock here. So this is going to be the final question. I really want to thank everybody who asked such great questions. This is from Kim Brown, and she says, where or how do you think this madness will end? I mean, do you think international leaders will hold grudges with future administrations because of Trump's actions?
Yes, I think that there's lasting damage to America's standing in the world, right? I think, commitment to alliances, commitment to making values and human rights an essential part of foreign policy. And again, trust me, I'm not professing that the US had a close to perfect record on that in years past, but there's definitely been a retreat of connecting those things. I mean, just look at dealing with the murder of Khashoggi, or, the Uyghur, a whole host of, or Russia, right? I mean, the president has not said Russia don't get involved in the Belarus, democracy protests. So that stuff, again, it's easily lost, hard to gain back. But the U.S. has made turns before. The thing is, Trump is not, he's not he represents feelings and movements in this country, right, that won't disappear the day that he leaves office, whether that's in a few months or in 4 years. And, we still have a highly divided political system, and you're going to have people who believe in QAnon still win primaries and possibly seats in Congress. It won't disappear. You hope that it dies out or is kept under limits so that those people don't have positions of power, or not many of them. But it's going to take time, and it's not all in just one day. It's not, if it changes on November 3rd, it's not all just about that one day.
Are you allowed to prognosticate about whether it changes on November 3rd?
My prognostication record's not great. I don't know. I mean, listen, I will say this about polls. I know people are like, I don't believe any polls anymore. I mean, I wouldn't go that far, because the polls clearly show a lead for Biden, right? I mean, they do. And, these guys, they try to learn the lessons from, where they missed. And I think they also try to learn the lessons of just kind of, adding things up. Part of the 2016 mistake was just like looking at a bunch of small trends and saying, oh, it's so obvious what's going to happen here. There's still 2 months to the election, and a lot of these things can change in certain states and so on. So I think people are smarter about that. But I don't look at the polls and say it's all BS. I mean, clearly it's an indicator as to where things stand today, but a lot can change in the next couple months.
I just want to thank both of you, Daniel, Jim Sciutto. Of course, I know how to pronounce your name.
Sciutto reminds me of being a kid in New York. It's fun.
Yeah, forget about it. Anyhow, Madman Theory, Trump Takes on the World. It's an amazing book. And you also have another book, The Shadow War. So if you've already read this and you want to go into the backlist, and hopefully you have another book coming next. Are you thinking about that?
Oh, if my wife would kill me if I didn't take a couple months off. So.
All right, take some time off. We really appreciate it. And Megan, thank you so very much for hosting this event. And once again, everybody go watch the Democratic Convention. It should be a big night.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time and your interest in this. It's really flattering. I wish you all the best, and I wish I could see you all in person. I wish this wasn't the age of Zoom.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.